Hello, I'm Bruce DuPoit. Coming up today on News Talk, those new laws that require voters to show photo ID at the polls. Are they intended to make sure our elections are fraud-free, or are they meant to make it more difficult for certain people to vote? Well, it depends on who you ask. And today, we ask Reverend Graylin Hagler and Republican activist Raynard Jackson. Then, the career sacrifices that moms and dads make. A new survey finding that most parents make decisions that have significant impact on their career advancement, and they do it in order to be right by their kids. Also for you this time, young people meeting internet friends in real life. It may sound dangerous, but it turns out they do it all the time. We'll discuss both of these topics with Washington Post columnist Petula Dvorak.
From News Channel 8, this is News Talk with Bruce DuPoit.
Hi, everybody. Good to have you with us. Thanks for making us part of your day on this Tuesday. We begin with one of the central questions of our time. Are new voter ID laws really about election security, as backers maintain, or is there something more sinister going on? We discussed this yesterday, if you were with us, as Huffington Post reporter Samantha Lockman joined us, a segment that you can find on our blog, news8newstalk.com. Joining us now here on the program, in a moment, we'll talk with Reverend Graylin Hagler, senior minister at Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ. He's on his way. He'll be here in a moment. He's a progressive activist in the District of Columbia. Raynard Jackson is here. He's a Republican activist and commentator from Maryland. Good to see you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Reverend Hagler joining us in just a second. Good to have you here today.
Thank you.
What do you think about the new voter ID requirements, the photo ID requirements that have popped up in many states over the last couple of years?
Well, I support voter ID, and there's nothing inherently discriminatory about it. Now, where I criticize my party, the Republican Party, is that you don't do voter ID and election law changes during an election cycle. You do it during an off-election year. But the voter ID in and of itself, I think, is a great idea.
Why?
Well, simply because, number one, you don't know who people are when they go to vote. Now, you can go up there and say, "Hi, I'm Bruce DuPoit," in your polling place. They don't know whether you're Bruce or not. So what's the problem with showing a government-issued ID? We got to go into the Congress, the airport, to go to do a banking transaction. So this notion about it being discriminatory is a bunch of bullcrap.
Why do you think it's generating so much controversy?
Because I think the Democrats have been masterful on the PR side of the issue and turning it into a racial issue. And when you mention race to Republicans, they're like deer in the headlight. Whether they're guilty of anything or not, just the mere allegation stymies them.
Reverend Hagler, good to see you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Raynard Jackson.
How you doing?
Raynard Jackson, Reverend Hagler. Good to have both of you here. Raynard Jackson supports photo ID. Many people see something other than a desire to make sure our elections are fair and fraud-free at work. What's your view?
Well, the issue is there's really been no fraud except when we elected President Bush in Florida, right, which was basically decided by the Supreme Court. I mean, the fact is that we've been doing this for years. There's been not the exclusion of voters. The only exclusion of voters has been when states have illegally put in place types of restrictions that prevented people from voting. So when we talk about voter ID cards, you're really talking about another level with which to prevent people from voting.
But photo ID is so common in our world, and voting is so important. Mm-hmm. Why not marry the two? Why not? Because you would hate to get to your polling place in your neighborhood
Sure.
on election day. You may have waited on a line. If you're like me, you love the election day atmosphere, and you're excited about being able to make your preferences known and participate in the electoral process. If you got to the table and the lady said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Reverend, someone else already voted in your name," you would really be upset.
But the issue with that, Bruce, is if we make some openness in terms of everybody being able to vote. For example, in my community, my church, I got people without ID cards. I got people who don't drive. I got people who've given up ID cards a long time ago, who are maybe elderly now, so whatever they have is not even updated with their photograph, a contemporary photograph. So the reality is this is very class biased. This is in a sense, it's another layer in order to keep people from being able to vote. There's all kinds of other ways in which to certify people's voting. It's like when I go into the voting booth in Washington, D.C., my address is certified. My previous signature is certified. certified in the ballot before I'm allowed to vote, before I'm giving a voting card. There's all kinds of ways, and what we need to be about is really figuring out ways in which we open the doors for people being able to vote rather than to close the door to exclude people from voting.
Raynor Jackson, there is no disagreement that we're seeing more of these laws in the recent period. We've seen more in the last couple of years than we probably saw in the decade prior to that. Is it because we can point to actual voter fraud as the triggering mechanism for this new wave of laws?
It's not about voter fraud as far as having a prima facie case to make that there has been fraud perpetrated in the electoral process. It's about voter integrity. That's the difference. Now, isn't it amazing, Bruce, during the congressionals last year, voting was down, which is expected, not nationwide. But you know where the voting turnout increased? It was in the state of Georgia, which has one of the most restrictive voter ID laws and one of the largest population of blacks. Blacks outnumbered as far as turnout any other group in the country last year.
Why do you think this is happening? What do you think at the bottom line, reality level, what's going on? What's the motivation? What's the bottom line?
I always urge people not to be ahistorical. After Reconstruction, we put in place all kinds of ways in which to keep particularly black populations from the polls, even intimidation, as well as literacy tests, poll tax, all those other types of things. This is really another manifestation of that. You end up with the Supreme Court gutting the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which we just celebrated 50 years of that.
That's not true.
And yes, they did. And so they gutted that, and immediately you have all these states, the former Confederate states, that began to put in place all kinds of implementations with which to restrict voting. And again, that's a part of the reaction to really the third Reconstruction that we're in now.
What does it say to you that one party seems to be driving the bus here?
Well, it's one party that does not really want to face the electorate, really does not want to face the length and breadth of the electorate, don't want to face black folks, don't want to face Latino folks, want to make sure that the people who vote is the narrowest kind of constituency that they can define.
He's referring to your party, Raynor Jackson.
Yeah. Let's talk about this voting rights case that the Supreme Court dealt with.
And we'll do that. We'll do that. Can you respond to the point that Reverend Hagler just
Well,
made?
that's totally not true. As I was telling you earlier, liberals have done a masterful job of scaring Republicans by using the word race, voter suppression, because that evokes a certain memory back to the civil rights days. There is no such thing as voter suppression. How is it that President Obama won in 2012 Indiana, which had a voter ID law? That was the first time a Democrat had won Indiana since 1964. And guess what? Turnout was up 30% in Indiana. So if this voter ID is supposed to depress turnout, it's not working.
We had a Huffington Post reporter here yesterday who said that in one state, I hope I'm not wrong, my best memory is she said it was Texas, allows gun club ID,
but not student ID. Which is stupid. That's totally stupid. And see, this is where Republicans get in trouble. They take a good issue on principle and then screw it up by not allowing the student to use the school ID.
Because it's a racist agenda.
That's not a racist.
It is a racist agenda.
Okay, so
I mean, that's a heavy charge. Why do you make it?
Well, I make it as a racist agenda because everything that they've been about has been to marginalize the population of black folks, to marginalize
but wait a minute, Bruce had to show an ID as well, so if it was racist, it would only be for us.
Brother, understand your history now.
Oh, I live history.
Right, coming out of Reconstruction, we met with all of the restrictions.
That has nothing to do with what we're talking about today.
And we had to push in 1965 to put in place a Voting Rights Act.
Does Bruce have to show his ID?
The Supreme Court since has stripped.
Does Bruce have to show his ID when he goes to vote?
Engaged in a battle with which to enfranchise those.
Does Bruce have to show his ID?
We're trying to deal with folks who are still coming out of prison, still dealing with my mother and father who are senior citizens.
But that has nothing to do with the Voting Rights Act.
Do not have active, really photo voting IDs. I mean, the fact is that we're trying to open up the doors. Why in a democracy do we want to close the doors? Ask the question.
I'm with you on that. I support more people voting.
The issue is more people.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
That's where we got to come from.
But does Bruce have to show an ID when he goes to vote?
I don't know what Bruce does in his jurisdiction. Right?
Yeah, they don't require.
No, but I'm saying if the voter ID is across the board, it's not just black folks.
State by state.
No, but I'm saying within that state, everybody in the state has to show ID, not just black folks.
But I'm saying that those who are in power are putting in place the rules with which to restrict restrict the population that they're most afraid of.
Let me tell you an example.
And you need to stop trying to defend.
No. Let me give you a real example.
From the whole Republican Party.
Does the gun club student ID example where if you have a gun club ID, that's a legitimate form of ID for you to complete the voter registration process. If you have a student ID, it is not. Does that dovetail with the larger point you're making?
Oh, sure. I mean, it really smacks at the sort of the discrimination in terms of the constituency you want, which is gun-toting folks who got gun IDs versus students who you define mostly vote liberal or progressive, and therefore you don't want liberals and progressives to vote.
If it only applies to the black community in the state of Texas. It applies to everyone in the state of Texas.
So it's discriminatory.
It's still discriminatory. It can't be by definition.
I mean, no, you can argue by definition or whatever you want. When you start putting in place things to restrict a certain,
but if it applies to everybody,
certain profile of voters, right? You know students.
But it's not profile.
You're arguing if the rules apply to everyone, they're fair on their face.
Exactly.
Right, but that's not the case right now.
We'll sneak in a quick break here.
And that's not the argument either.
Reverend Graylin Hagler and Raynard Jackson. A break, yes, and back with more right after this. Continuing our conversation here on News Talk with Republican activist and commentator Raynard Jackson and with the Reverend Graylin Hagler of Plymouth Congregational UCC Church in the district. It's great having both of you here. Such a good issue. I want to pick up on something, Raynard Jackson, that you said a moment ago in response to Reverend Hagler. He said the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a measure of huge historical significance, 50th anniversary just days ago. Your response was, no, they didn't. Can you explain why you...
That's one of the biggest lies out there since the Supreme Court. What they did with Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, basically, and let me break it down like Donald Trump in a way that people can understand.
Careful now.
Right. Now, I'm not going to talk about women. I'm not talking about women.
Donald Trump, I need to add. Nobody understands.
All the Supreme Court said...
Except a good right-wing constituency out there.
All the Supreme Court said was, we don't like your suit. So we want you to get a new suit. We want you to be dressed. We don't want you walking around naked. And so what they say, change the formula, update it for the 21st century, because they was using the formula back to from the 60s. That's all they said to do.
That's not exactly true. Basically, one of the ruling majority basically said, and one of the Supreme Court justices said, was that the issues of race is a different world. The issues of race are null and void. And this requirement that you come to the Justice Department and submit what you want to change is no longer valid. Well, here we are in a Black Lives Matter world. So things have not changed.
Really?
Texas immediately went and put in place some of the strictest voter ID laws.
But yet turnout is up.
Which has just been struck down, I need to point out. Right? But the fact that you can talk about turnout is up, and I'm going to tell you why. You know why turnout is up?
Please tell me.
Black folks got out and voted for Barack Obama.
But wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. You said this is voter suppression, though.
And he put together a broad multiracial coalition.
That's right, put together a broad multiracial
But wait a minute, guys. You can't have it both ways. You can't tell me this is voter suppression, these ID laws, but yet turnout is up. Which one is it? It can't be both.
Look. Don't argue from a ludicrous point of view.
But numbers don't lie. Either voter turnout is up or it's not.
The ludicrous point of view is that folks voted, and in Reconstruction, in spite of...
No, we're talking about 2012.
Excuse me, in spite of the risk on their lives. It comes down to people's ability to organize. That's what we did in 1965. That's what we did continuing on up until this point. And President Barack Obama and his folks did a miraculous job of organizing a broad range, a multiracial constituency that had interests that turned out. Folks who had never voted in their lives turned out because they felt like they had something to vote for. That's a problem where we are right now, is most people really right now don't feel that they have something to vote for, and then there's all this other
That's called a choice, though.
And there's this other kind of restrictive policy to say you don't count.
Raynard Jackson.
I'm confused. You all are saying that these ID laws are going to decrease voter turnout because it's discriminatory and it's going to put an undue burden on black folks. But yet all the numbers say that voter turnout in the black community has been outpacing the white community. So which is it?
The allegation is that the...
I'm talking about the numbers, not the allegation.
No, I get it. The allegation, what you hear a lot, is that certain communities are going to find it more difficult to meet the requirements to register to vote if the laws that are being backed by one party. I mean, and that's the interesting thing about this.
But Bruce, here's the interesting thing. In 2012, during the presidential election, I think even you agree with me, black turnout was more than the white vote for the first time in the history of this country.
You can't talk
about those are numbers.
You can't talk about the historical aberration of folks having something to vote for. In fact, let me point out. I think it was in Texas. Texas moved a polling place to a place where there was no population and no public transportation. Those are the kinds of tactics that are being used. Not only were we talking about voting ID cards, but we're talking about folks changing what they're doing on the ground to be able to discourage voters, such as to put, in Ohio, a lack of poll workers in the polling place so that the line is stretched around the street.
I'm with you on that. I'm with you on that.
So what we're talking about, there's not just a few ways in which voters are suppressed. There's a multitude of ways
in which voters are suppressed. How do you say suppression if turnout is up, though?
And you got to focus on those ways. You can't.
That's a non sequitur.
Stop talking about the aberration of folks who turned out to vote for President
So ignore the numbers.
Right?
Ignore the numbers.
Go back and look at the numbers.
I have.
Go back and
Blacks
look at
for the first time in the history of this country outpolled white folks in 2012. That's indisputable.
Don't tell me about the last election or the election previous to that. You got to go back and tell me about the other elections, because one thing that happened that was very different.
Well, you didn't have these laws on the books.
There was one thing that was very different in this election. This is why you can't argue that. Is that folks who voted for the first time felt they had something to vote for. Right? The reality is what's going on from the Republican Party is that they're doing all kinds of things in terms of to restrict voter participation.
What is it if numbers are up?
Why are you going to justify voter suppression in a time?
But numbers are up. It couldn't be suppression.
Increasing voter participation.
And here's the thing that puts this in a questionable category for some people. The making our elections fair and fraud-free, that is a universal belief that we all have a stake in that game. And yet Republicans have not been able to find Democratic co-sponsors for the legislation because it just doesn't feel to the folks across the aisle like it's something that really has at its heart an integrity component. It feels more like an attempt to skew the electorate to meet the partisan considerations of the moment. In other words, if you don't appeal to young people, if you don't appeal to people of color, if you don't appeal to older people, well, rather than broaden the appeal, shrink the electorate.
Do you realize even Mexico has voter ID laws, and they have not had a problem with supposed voter suppression discrimination? But again,
we're talking about the history and the character of the United States of America.
I'm having a hard time reconciling the fact that blacks outnumbered poll-wise white folks for the first time in history of the country. So if there's voter suppression, you expect numbers to be down, not up.
Your operative word is the first time in history. That's your operative word. Then you got to ask yourself.
30% in North Carolina.
And then, Brother Jackson, you got to ask yourself the question: why is that the first time in history? Because if you're a historian, then there's got to be some type of aberration that is engaged in, if it's not a historical pattern.
So you'll be watching to see what happens when, as Barack Obama moves off the stage, and assuming, as possibly we can, that neither party will have an African American nominee next time. Those are the numbers you'll be watching.
That's the numbers we'll be watching. That'll tell you where we really are, and it'll tell us also the kinds of suppression tactics we also encounter on the ground, such as in Baltimore, for example. Every time there's an election, they put flyers out on cars and say, if you're a convicted felon, if you show up at the polls, you'll be instantly arrested.
So black folks are dumb, is what you're saying?
No, I'm not.
Black folks don't know when an election is.
No, I'm not saying that. You missed the point.
You talk about these flyers that Republicans put on windshields in the black community. That says it's insulting to the black electorate.
Are you to put the flyers on the windshield?
No, that
you would never.
No, not at all. I wouldn't admit
it. and the corollary flyer is the one that says that the election's on Wednesday, not Tuesday. We certain areas have a history of that as well. Great conversation, important issue. Raynard Jackson, Reverend Braylon Hagler. I hope you'll both come back and be with us again. Important conversation. Good to have you both here. When we return, the sacrifices that parents make for their kids.